Good afternoon. My name is Janice, and my son Gavin, and my husband Brooks, and we are visiting the Netherlands from Vanuatu in the South Pacific, where we run a small nonprofit called Island Reach, working with Indigenous partners on climate change, adaptation, and biodiversity conservation.
Okay. You're still in school. What's your age?
So I'm 16. I'm the son of Janice and Brooks, and I collaborate and work with them wherever I can in their collaborations with Vanuatu.
Okay.
Indigenous folk.
And what's your job? What do you do?
So I don't have a set job. I'm coming out of the age of following them around as someone who is too young. But now I'm getting into the arts of film work and of social collaboration with people.
Coral gardening and
Coral gardens.
yeah.
This kind of conservation work. Vanuatu is 83 islands, 250,000 people. They cover 120 languages among them. We work in a common pidgin with them called Bishlama, as well as French and English. This kind of conservation work is grassroots and therefore highly diversified. So we wear many, many hats. And yet at the end of the day, we're providing resources and facilitation and some science-based counsel. We're social scientists ourselves in anthropology and psychology. We run an agricultural operation in the United States, a forest farm. We're very interested in grassroots actors owning and controlling and managing their projects, particularly among Indigenous people who have local ecological knowledge and capabilities that are far beyond ours in terms of how to handle marine and forestscapes, or what we often call ridge to reef landscapes. Their projects, which we're supporting, will range from coral gardening and restoration that are becoming embedded in expanding conservation plans that can be called taboo or custom plans, along with some science framing. These kinds of plans in this part of the world always have to address food security, how people protect their access to protein, how people protect their access to food resources in the context of conservation. So conservation there is all about lower the pressure, build a resource, lower the pressure, build a resource, create different kinds of harvesting methods, getting away from extractive harvesting methods like little tiny fishing nets, or monetizing the harvest too much so that people are chasing fish or other resources for money, as opposed to for what the community needs.
But we see as people build their adaptation projects, climate change, the pressures of climate change, the impacts are mounting, and it's just really challenging for people to.
So we've been there for 8 years. Projects already well underway are being knocked down by escalating climate change. The hundreds of different environmental workers we work with, the folks in Vanuatu are called Ni Vanuatu, and these environmental workers have a loose association, a grassroots association called the Vanuatai, supported through a theater group called One Small Bag there, and we are supporters of those people primarily. And they are learning more and more about climate change and about the crisis of carbon, and that this is not going to draw down quickly, and that their conditions are going to worsen. And the question is whether mitigation will move quickly enough to forestall some of the worst and most devastating outcomes of climate change while they hold ground and do the conservation work that they have expertise in. So we're now on expedition. We've been at sea. I'm a captain, an ocean captain of a vessel, and we've been at sea for 8 years. Now our expeditions are moving from Vanuatu to Vietnam, to Morocco, to here, to the EU, building stories and demonstrations of the interconnectivity and the interdependency between those regions of the world, and often among Indigenous actors who have the capacity to do really phenomenal scale work conserving biodiversity and holding the ground as best they can, and their demand to have a seat at the table among those here who can march and push for mitigation, because folks here have access to industry, they have access to the governments that are deeply embroiled in the carbon economy. And so there's this interdependency between carbon mitigation, the demand for carbon drawdown, and those who are holding the line in the other parts of the world. And we believe that stronger stories, stronger connectivity, stronger alliances between these groups is what an international movement means, and it will bring more people into the urgency and the emergent crisis of mitigation, which is carbon must be drawn down. After that, we all have plenty of problems to deal with, and there's all kinds of crises to solve, but without a carbon drawdown, everything else really becomes moot. And that's what that's a kind of video filming and storytelling and collecting here more video material that we can bring back to Vanuatu and to Vietnam and Morocco.
Because you're working on a video?
Yeah, we're working on a modest video that Janice you can describe.
Yeah, our goal is to bring stories together, to combine stories from different places where people don't necessarily have either the right to protest or they don't have the means to really unite and protest at an international on an international stage. They don't have a lot of wealth, or so that their stories aren't being heard as much, and so we're just trying to facilitate the sharing of those stories, bringing these stories to wider audiences in order to build solidarity across these different domains.
Okay, and do you see any progress in the communication between there and here?
We see the progress as perhaps beginning more when we're hearing about movements through groups like Extinction Rebellion, through groups like 350, which is very active in the South Pacific, 350.org, that we've been associated with at times. But I think the stories are easily lost due to distance and due to people being very embroiled in their local contexts. And so our work, we're social scientists, cultural anthropology, cross-cultural psychology. We run an agricultural operation in the U.S. Our work is as culture brokers, meaning limited work to be a vehicle of conveyance for stories and information. Ultimately, stories have to be about actions, and it's only actions at this point that are going to demonstrate hope and demonstrate the potential for hope in the context of this crisis. So we're very sensitive to the times and the idea that this is not a time for too much talk. This is a time for action. And what we're excited about representing is that folks in Vanuatu, they live action. It's what they do, and so they have leadership there. They have guidance for people from all over the world, not only about how to survive with a small carbon footprint, but how to take action and be physical and be engaged. And not simply just talk about things, and not just simply imagine a better world, but to do something.
But just if I could add one thing on that, I think one of the things that, as I look at climate mobilization movements, one of the things, we're in a sense we're in a community where a lot of people are talking about climate change, but the vast majority of people aren't talking about it. And so one of the things that I think is that we're exploring, that we're trying to do, is just bring the topic into conversations as many places as possible, and with people who maybe don't want to hear about it, but at least to keep it on the table. I spoke with someone yesterday.
Which I think is the focus of this video.
Right. And yesterday we spoke with some young activists here in The Hague who said that during the big recent heat wave in Europe here, a lot of the media didn't really represent climate change in their story about the heat, but it was really more kind of, isn't this novel, isn't this fun? And they really only heard very little from a few sources about climate change. So just talking about it, talking with lots of people, and that's part of what this effort is in our video, is just sharing stories, getting it out as much as we can.
And to some extent, trying to make sure that those stories don't become their own stopping point. So, for example, climate change is often critiqued as its own kind of curve out of the discussion of climate disruption, which can be also a curve out of what the effective fact of climate disruption is, which is an accelerating extinction event. And it is that accelerating extinction event which is so profoundly going to affect all of us, and is already so profoundly underway in so many parts of the world, and has been for some time. And of course, many of these actions precipitating extinction precede even noticing the shift in the climate. Anthropogenic effects from over-harvesting, over-grazing, over-extraction, extractive economies, population impacts, all of these are at play. What's really becoming explosive now is that the change in the weather locally, the change in harvesting strategies, From our farm in the US to Vanuatu to Vietnam to Morocco, everything's shifting by a month or more. Everything's becoming irregular and unsteady. Every farmer is having to work harder, is having to expense more, and facing the concerns of having to give up as they expense and put up some really important project for food or income for the family and gets wiped out. And so that crisis of food security escalating is a parallel crisis to an extinction event, which I think is even more difficult to bring really and put it on the table and really grasp that a context is being created in which humans just aren't going to have any resources to work with or survive with due to it. And it's hard to convey, but when we've been sailing the oceans for 8 years. We've worked at sea for 8 years and captaining a research vessel that has been working in the Atlantic and in the Caribbean and in the Pacific, and watching the oceans draw down and become quiet is a stunning phenomenon, because one, it's hard to imagine because you don't see that many boats out there, but the oceans are becoming quiet. Resources, fish resources are plummeting. It's stunning.
And reefs are dying.
And so to some extent, we also understand that activism maybe can be inspired by stories, but really also needs to be inspired by experience. And people who really become active, often it's because they've really felt something that's really happened, that something's really hit them. And that kind of leadership, that kind of capacity we're looking for, and we want to aggregate, we want to tell stories about, and we're bringing those stories from Melanesia and Vietnam and Morocco.
Okay, thank you very much. Good luck.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good luck to you all.